Picture a railroad construction camp somewhere in the Nevada desert, 1869. 500 men are grading rock, drilling powder charges by hand, and sleeping in canvas tents 100 yards from the blast line. No hard hats, no blast radius protocols, no incident reports. Just the foreman's word and your own nerve keeping you alive. Here is the question nobody in a Western ever asks. If you dropped a single federal safety inspector into that camp with modern authority to enforce modern standards, how long before the whole operation shuts down? The answer is going to surprise you. To understand why modern safety law would gut the frontier economy, you first have to understand what legal environment those workers were actually operating in. For the core Old West period, roughly 1848 to 1890, there was no federal workplace safety agency of any kind. Not a weak one. Not an underfunded one. None. The first wave of state factory safety laws did not even begin until the 1880s and 1900s. Workers' compensation, the system that forces employers to financially absorb injury costs, did not reach most states until the 1910s and 1920s. OSHA did not exist until 1970. The frontier economy was built entirely before the first generation of safety law had even been drafted. The number that anchors this whole conversation is deaths per 1,000 workers per year. That is how economic historians measure how lethal an industry actually was. And when you look at the most dangerous frontier industries around 1900, railroads, hard rock mining, and logging, the rates were several deaths per 1,000 workers annually. Non-fatal injury rates ran dozens of times higher than that. To put it another way, if you worked a dangerous frontier trade for a decade, the statistical odds that you would be killed or permanently maimed on the job were not a remote possibility. They were a real and recurring feature of the work itself. Here is what makes that number even more staggering. By the late 20th century, after a full century of workers' compensation laws, federal safety regulation, and engineering improvements, workplace death rates in U.S. industry had fallen by over 90% compared to those late 19th and early 20th century levels. And on the railroad specifically, annual fatalities by the late 20th century were down to roughly 1/8 of what they were at the 1910 peak. That means the frontier railroad industry was not just a little dangerous. It was operating at a scale of worker death that modern society would classify as a catastrophe requiring immediate shutdown. Let's start with the industry that literally built the West railroad construction. The transcontinental lines of the 1860s and 1870s were funded on a simple, brutal logic. Labor was cheap, replacement workers were available, and the cost of a dead worker fell entirely on the worker's family, not the railroad company. Under modern OSHA standards, a railroad construction outfit would be required to document every blast, enforce exclusion zones, provide fall protection on grading cuts, and maintain detailed injury logs. Any single fatality would trigger a federal investigation. The 1869 transcontinental push, which relied on constant powder blasting and round-the-clock shifts, would have been halted at dozens of points before it was half finished. The powder monkey was the man who loaded and tamped the black powder charges into drilled holes in rock faces. He worked close enough to the blast point that a misfire or an early detonation meant he was gone. Under modern mine safety and health administration rules, that role would require certified blasting credentials, documented fuse timing, a designated blast coordinator, a written exclusion zone for every charge, and a post-blast atmospheric check before anyone re-entered the area. The powder monkey as a job category would simply cease to exist, not because the work was unnecessary, but because the legal cost of doing it the old way would make the entire operation economically impossible. Hard rock mining in the territories was its own category of catastrophe. The silver and gold mines of Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona ran shafts hundreds of feet straight down into rock, ventilated by whatever air happened to drift through. Miners breathed silica dust every shift of every working day, and the lung disease that followed, silicosis, was so common it was considered an occupational inevitability rather than a preventable condition. Modern MSHA regulations required dust monitoring, mandatory ventilation systems, and respirator programs. A typical 1880s hard rock mine would fail every single one of those requirements simultaneously. They called it a job. Most folks today would call it a death sentence. Now, let's talk about the cattle drive, because this is where the mythology really breaks down. The long drives from Texas to the Kansas railheads in the 1860s and 1870s involved cowboys working 18 to 20-hour days in the saddle, crossing flooded rivers, managing stampedes at night, and sleeping on open ground in whatever weather arrived. Modern labor law would require documented working hours, mandatory rest periods, and a baseline of safe working conditions. A cattle outfit running a 90-day drive with a crew of a dozen men would be in violation of federal labor standards before the herd cleared the Red River. The drive as an economic model depended entirely on the absence of those protections. The muleskinner, the man who drove freight wagons across the territories with teams of up to 20 mules, operated equipment that had no brakes worth the name on mountain grades, no standardized harness inspection, and no load weight limits enforced by anyone. A runaway freight wagon on a steep canyon road was not a freak accident. It was a known and recurring risk that every muleskinner accepted as part of the job description. Under modern commercial vehicle regulations, those wagons would require load documentation, brake certification, and route hazard assessments. The freight economy of the territories moved because nobody was checking any of those boxes. The buffalo hide trade deserves its own chapter in this conversation, because it would not just be slowed by modern regulation. It would be stopped entirely. At the peak of the southern herd slaughter in the early 1870s, professional hide hunters were killing tens of thousands of animals per season. Today, that activity would fall under the Endangered Species Act framework and federal wildlife protection statutes. The commercial hunting of a keystone species at industrial scale for export profit would be a federal felony. The entire economic structure of the Southern Plains hide trade, which was also a deliberate military strategy to starve out the Comanche and other nations, would be illegal from the first trigger pull. Frontier logging camps in the Pacific Northwest and the Sierra Nevada ran on a similar logic of acceptable loss. Fallers worked with cross-cut saws and axes on trees that could be 200 feet tall and 10 feet across at the base. When a tree went wrong in its fall, you had roughly 2 seconds to identify the direction and run. The term for a tree that falls unpredictably was a widowmaker, and it was not a colorful nickname. It was a documented cause of death listed in camp records. Modern forestry safety requires felling plans, escape route designation, and exclusion zones. A 19th century logging outfit would fail a modern OSHA inspection on the first day of operations, probably within the first hour. Here is something that the mythology consistently gets wrong. The popular image of the Old West is built around gunfights, outlaws, and violent death by firearm. But historical research on frontier communities finds that many Western towns were actually less violent than modern big cities, and that lethal violence varied significantly by place and time. A lot of order in frontier communities was maintained through informal and private means. The real mass killer on the frontier was not the six-shooter, it was the job. The workplace was where men died in numbers that dwarfed anything happening in the saloon. Hollywood got the hats right and just about nothing else. The financial logic of the frontier economy was brutally simple. When the cost of a worker's death fell entirely on the worker's family, employers had no direct financial incentive to reduce that risk. Workers' compensation changed that equation by making the employer absorb injury and death costs, which is exactly why industry lobbied hard against it for decades. The frontier cattle baron, the mine owner, and the railroad company all operated in a world where a dead worker was a minor administrative note, not a financial liability. The moment you attach legal and financial consequences to worker deaths, the entire cost structure of those operations transforms overnight. The boomtown itself was a product of the safety vacuum. Towns like Virginia City, Deadwood, and Tombstone grew fast because the extractive industries feeding them were running at maximum speed with minimum overhead. No ventilation requirements slowing the mine. No blast documentation adding days to the railroad schedule. No rest mandates cutting into the cattle drive timetable. The moment you add even the first generation of state factory safety laws from the 1880s and 1900s, the pace of extraction slows, the cost per unit rises, and the thin margin that made a boomtown viable starts to disappear. The boomtown was not just a cultural phenomenon. It was a direct product of unregulated industrial labor. The timeline of regulation tells you exactly when the frontier economy started to die. The 1880s brought the first state factory inspection laws. The 1900s brought early railroad safety acts targeting the specific carnage on rail lines. The 1910s and 1920s brought workers' compensation. Each new layer of regulation added cost and constraint to industries that had been built on the assumption that neither existed. The frontier as an economic model did not close in 1890 because Frederick Jackson Turner declared it closed. It closed because the legal environment that made it profitable was being dismantled one statute at a time. The West was not one. It was just outlasted by whoever could take the punishment. What is worth sitting with for a moment is what all of this actually means for the men who lived it. The powder monkey drilling a charge in a Nevada cliff face in 1872 did not choose that work because he was indifferent to his own survival. He chose it because the alternatives were worse, because the pay was marginally better than farm labor, and because the legal framework that might have protected him simply did not exist yet. The danger was not a bug in the system. It was the system. These were not reckless men. They were men operating inside an economy that had decided their survival was not worth the cost of accounting for it. Nobody put that in the history books, and I think you know why. The frontier economy was not a golden age of rugged self-reliance. It was a specific historical moment when capital could extract maximum value from labor because no legal mechanism existed to stop it. The railroad, the mine, the cattle outfit, and the hide operation were all profitable in direct proportion to how much risk they could transfer onto the bodies of the men doing the work. When you understand that, the question this video started with answers itself. One federal safety inspector with modern authority would not slow those operations. He would end them. Because the moment the cost of worker safety becomes the employer's problem, the math that built the frontier stops working entirely. If this channel is your kind of history, the kind that measures danger in actual numbers instead of dramatic music, then hit subscribe and stay close. Every week we go back into the jobs that the Westerns skipped over because they were too brutal, too specific, and too real. Next up, we are going into the hide yards of Dodge City, the men who processed the buffalo carcasses after the hunters moved on. A job so dangerous and so foul that even frontier workers considered it the bottom of the labor market. You will not want to miss it.